Books and movies provide only virtual experiences, but those experiences are valuable nonetheless. Of course, travelling somewhere yourself and taking in the local atmosphere would be superior. Climbing a mountain yourself would unquestionably provide a higher quality experience than listening to someone else describe climbing one. But a person can only do so much, and so there is value in sharing in another's experiences vicariously through books and film. Stories allow you to experience places you could never go, the past, the future, or distant worlds. You can become a different ethnicity or gender. Even when you're reading all by yourself, you're sharing those stories as they unfold with countless people whom you've never met. We are alone, but we are connected. This excerpt, taken from Hideo Kojima's The Creative Gene, manages to perfectly describe the beauty of escapism, the necessity of stories, both fantastical and informative, in inspiring and connecting us. Framed through the lens of the past 2 years, spent living in a global pandemic, and these comments have only become more pertinent. What better way to experience adventure while being confined to our homes than through art such as movies, books, and of course video games? At a time when I could barely leave my home, Death Stranding allowed me to do something that I love, safely and vicariously, that COVID had kept me from doing, and that's travelling, hiking, and exploring nature. It transported me to this beautiful and otherworldly landscape. The game mechanics made me feel every bump, every rock, and every tumble. The sound design allowed me to feel the wind, the grass, and the trees, all while connecting with other people, firstly in-game by encountering other players' paths and structures, but also through sharing the game with my community on my Twitch channel. That feeling that Kojima described, of enjoying a story, watching it unfold while tacitly being connected to the people who are also experiencing it, was made tangible in Death Stranding. It's a solitary game, yet you are constantly connected to the other people who are on the same journey through the game's mechanics. We are alone, but connected. And now that the world has opened back up, I decided to reconnect with some old friends and take a trip to Iceland, to experience the country that inspired the world of Death Stranding, to put myself in Sam's shoes by traversing the Icelandic highlands, across lava fields, mountains and snowdrifts, through the cold, wind and rain, across rivers and ravines, to look upon firsthand the alien and beautifully barren landscape that was so masterfully recreated in the Decima engine by Kojima Productions. I went searching for that first-hand experience that Kojima describes, documenting it as I went, and in doing so I hope to take you along for the journey to try and relate and share my experiences in this real-life mirror of Death Stranding. This journey isn't just about walking in Sam's shoes, but also Kojima's. In August of 2014, Kojima was on vacation in Iceland, and while in Reykjavik he was recommended a music store. After picking out a few CDs in the store and taking them to the register, a song came over the radio. The band that happened to be playing was Low Roar. That store was likely 12 Toner, which also happens to be the independent record label which Low Roar was signed to. In The Creative Gene, Kojima talks about how he browses bookstores with a certain routine, a mantra almost, waiting for a certain book to call to him. This time, however, the art that called to Kojima was a piece of music. This chance encounter, this connection that he formed with Low Roar's music, would go on to shape much of the tone and atmosphere of Death Stranding, from the initial reveal trailer at E3 2016 to the final release, where much of Low Roar's back catalogue is used to punctuate key moments of reflection in the final game.
Bloody eyes, sweaty clothes, the routine that I've learned to understand and know.
Setting off, I put in my headphones and listened to Don't Be So Serious, the first track you hear from Low Roar in the game. The entire journey stretched out for days ahead of me. I was well rested and excited to take on the challenges to come, and I was listening to the song that always comes to mind first when I think of Death Stranding. Both the eerie and melancholic music from Low Roar, as well as the ethereal synths of Ludwig Forssell's original score, accompany the landscape of the game and the real-life Iceland perfectly. Iceland is truly like nowhere else on Earth. It is immediately recognisable, and it's that uniqueness that makes it feel like you're on another planet entirely. We set off and snaked our way gradually up between the Rhyolite Hills of Landmannalaugar in the Southern Highlands, with a daunting number of miles still ahead of us, occasionally turning back to look down at the start point. This part of the trail was well trodden and signposted, and while the climb into the hills was long, it wasn't especially difficult to navigate. Spirits were high, and the sun was attempting to peer through the clouds. The smell of sulphur was heavy in the air, and despite the bubbling of geysers and parts of the ground being warm to the touch, patches of snow and ice still clung to the hillsides. And where streams ran downwards, you could see small caves gouged out of the ice. Walking across the snowfields, I realised how grateful I was for the paths that had already been tracked into the snow. As with Death Stranding, the more frequently a path is walked, the deeper a trail is formed. This makes traversal and navigation a lot easier, especially when walking through snow. After a few hours, we encountered our first downpour. And while we didn't have BTs to worry about, I was concerned that if it persisted for too long, our gear might eventually become soaked right through. Setting up camp for the night in the rain wouldn't have been fun, especially with the majority of the trail still ahead of us. As well as the practical issues of constant rain, there is also the fact that it makes filming difficult, and it obscures a lot of the great views. We were at this point at the tallest peaks in the area, and would have been getting 360-degree views if not for the rain. Despite the layer of clouds, the area was still beautiful. Moss was attempting to grow in the lower valleys near the streams, and distant waterfalls dotted the landscape. And, as they say in Iceland, if you don't like the weather, just wait 5 minutes. And so the rain eventually let up, and we were approaching the end of the first leg of the journey. But first we needed to descend from the rusty hills of Landmannalaugar. As we pressed on, the hills gradually started to be flecked with more and more green, until eventually we were below the cloud line. And as the clouds slowly moved west to east below us, we were able to snatch glimpses of the day's endpoint. Far below, nestled between green and black hills, Alftvatn Lake. But before we could rest for the night, we first needed to tackle our first real obstacle, a river crossing. A task that would have been made a lot easier with an Odra deck. We had to search up and down the river for a point where it was shallow enough to wade through, but also slow moving enough that we wouldn't lose our footing. Eventually we found our crossing and one by one made our way across. The moment my feet were submerged, I could barely feel them. The frigid meltwater seemed to penetrate deep into my bones. But after a long day of hiking with sore feet, it was actually quite soothing. As if the sky didn't want us to finish the day being too dry, it let out one last smattering of rain as we approached the lake. But with the lake in sight, and the stunning fields and hills painted with every shade of green surrounding us, it didn't dampen our spirits. With the first day now behind us, the sun started to hide behind the distant hills, but wouldn't stay there for long. After just a few hours of twilight, it would start to rise again. We set up camp by the lake, having completed the first part of our journey, and got some well-earned rest. Landmannalaugar most closely resembles the volcanic area to the southwest of the central region. Like me, I'm sure many of you first envision the rolling green hills when thinking of Death Stranding, but the addition of an orange, red, volcanically active area of the map, complete with steam plumes and sulphurous pools, goes a long way towards giving the players a visually diverse sandbox while being a true representation of Iceland. I spent most of the day not consciously comparing the scenery to Death Stranding, instead acclimating myself to the mountains and generally just taking in the views. It wasn't until the first day was nearly behind me, as I descended towards the lake, that I had not only a striking visual connection to Death Stranding, but also a tangible insight into those moments in the game where you can catch your breath after a particularly tense or difficult segment. The day had been long, and after hours of walking up and down the peaks with the fatigue starting to set in, I was reminded of that first delivery to Port Knot City, one of the earliest challenges in the game, where you haul your cargo up the mountain, through the BTs and Timefall, and see Port Knot for the first time. I had also been rewarded with a stunning view of the lake and my destination. I couldn't resist popping in my headphones again and listening to Asylums for the Feelings as I made my way down. We awoke the following morning with no sign of the rain from the previous day, and the clouds and mist cleared. We were able to see the hills we had crossed to get to this point, and as if a line had been drawn between the previous day and the day to come, there was a stark contrast between the rusty, snow-strewn peaks to the north and the mossy valleys of the south. After spending a lazy hour at the shore, looking out across the mirrored waters of Altvarten, we decided to break down camp and find a spot for breakfast somewhere down the trail. The day promised more river crossings and the vast volcanic plains of Mayafelsander. We set off and moved east, up and over the small saddle between the hills that flanked the lake, and as we took the narrow path that gradually descended the other side, we were greeted by the stunning views of jagged, isolated mountains, and far off in the distance, the expansive glaciers of the Katla volcano. And after a couple of miles, we decided to procrastinate on our first river crossing of the day to eat some food and brew some coffee, occasionally glancing to the south towards the snowy range that we were hoping to reach in a few days' time. The day ahead was going to mostly be flat with the occasional river crossing, but I started to feel a little nervous about the mountains that dominated the horizon in the distance, and wondered how I'd handle the climb after 3 days of constant walking. But there were many miles between now and then, and the more immediate challenges were the rivers still ahead of us. At the first crossing of the day, feeling energized from our morning coffee, we splashed our way lazily across. The water was slow moving and surprisingly cool, owing to the fact that it was shallow and had had a chance to warm up in the sun as it zigzagged down from the mountains above. On the far bank we turned south, using the distant lone peak of Storasula as our orientation. After refilling our water bottles at a stream, we decided to take another, less earned break to do some exploring without the burden of our heavy packs. But before long, we continued onwards, down the gentle slopes and across the trickling streams, and as we trudged further into the valley, the stunted grasses and moss eventually gave way to more rocky terrain, which required a more cautious footing. The small tributaries we'd been crossing all morning would eventually confluence at a much larger river that was thankfully bridged. But a kilometre away, further down the route, was another crossing. Up till now, I'd either left the camera on the starting bank, recording the crossing and then going back for it, or simply held it in hand as I crossed. This river, however, was far too wide, deep, and fast-flowing to risk either crossing 3 times total to get the shot I'd like, or by holding the camera as I crossed, as I needed both hands free for balance. We eventually found a good place to cross and waded our way to the far bank. Once safe on the other side, I dried off and took care of the blisters that had started to form on my feet. The miles were starting to add up, and my feet were feeling it the most. But the day was far from over, so there was nothing to do but press on. With black volcanic rock and sand stretched to the horizon, and the sun rising to its zenith, we walked for what felt like hours, occasionally stopping to rest and hydrate in the sparse shade afforded by the small boulders and mounds. Far off to the south, dark clouds swirled above the mountains of Thorsmork, obscuring their peaks, and a single dirt bike raced across the volcanic desert, giving me a pang of jealousy as I walked with aching feet, the mountains that marked the end of the plain not seeming to get any larger. After what should have been a simple stream crossing that nearly ended in soggy feet and hurt egos. Oh, nearly. Yeah.
How close that was to it. Feel that?
I did catch that, yeah. Don't put my foot where you did. We eventually reached a river that had sliced a deep gully through the sun-baked rocks of the volcanic desert. I refilled my water, and after a short break spent in awe of the power of the torrent, we set off again, the end of the day feeling a lot closer. As we approached the end of the plain, I turned back one last time. Upon seeing the red mountains far to the north, I was able to appreciate just how far we'd come. But as I recalled the full route, tracing out our path in my head, I realized just how far there was still left to go. As we left the valley and moved between the more closely grouped lower hills beyond, we were blessed with a refreshing and welcome downpour after the long hours in the heat of the sun. But before we reached camp for the night, we were greeted with one last amazing scene. The deep black obsidian stones, now slick with rain, glistened in the shafts of light that were breaking through the clouds, and gave the impression of being coated in ice. We set up camp among the rocky hills of Emstra and fell asleep to the sounds of rain falling from the clouds that now blanketed the sky overhead. While having very little ascent, this leg of the journey wasn't without its challenges, mainly the river crossing. We had to assess the area and look for the best place to cross, deciding that the track that was used by vehicles to ford the river would likely have a deeper bed due to the weight of the vehicles, so we decided to move upstream. In Death Stranding, the environment contains information left by other players in the form of paths. This is true of river crossings in the game as well. Even without scanning the water's surface, you can generally tell where it's safer to cross from the worn areas on the banks created by the numerous other players who have crossed in that spot. For us, however, there was no visible paths other than the track used by vehicles, which we'd already ruled out. However, a chance encounter with a pair of hikers moving in the opposite direction meant they were able to show us the point at which they had crossed, and with that information we were able to follow their proven route to get safely to the other side. Other than the occasional porter, you will always primarily be reliant on these echoes of other players in the game world to help you navigate. Similarly, we were able to connect with the other travelers to help with our own navigation. The next morning, we set off from Emstra, with the goal of reaching the wooded valleys of Thorsmork by the day's end. And, as with yesterday, the first item on the agenda was food and coffee. We perched up on top of a hill that overlooked the basin below to boil our water and could hear the roar of an out-of-sight river. And as we descended the slope, making sure not to slip on the loose rubble underfoot, we took in the views of the Meertalsjökull ice cap of Katla to the north, whose meltwater was the source of the cascade below. We scrambled up the gorge that had been hewn out of the rock by the rapids, and paused to take a moment and appreciate once again the unbelievable scale and beauty of the scene before us. We then accompanied the river as it carved its way downwards, stopping only briefly to fill our water bottles at a stream that was feeding the larger river below. We continued on, the walls of the basin surrounding us on all sides, tinted in reds, greens, and blacks, until eventually we reached a crag at the southernmost point. We climbed up slowly, with the rolling hills and glaciers as our backdrop. Once atop the cliff, the land opened out into a large flat shelf, the river now unseen below us, but its footprint still visible as the mountains conformed to its path towards the ocean. The wind was brisk, but we had started to get a little hungry, so decided to take shelter behind some boulders and have ourselves a second breakfast. The day was far from over yet, and we would be following the Markafjorda river that had been our guide for the day, until we would go our separate ways, turning south towards Thorsmork as it continued west on its 62-mile journey to the sea. It was at this point in the trip, traipsing through the desert, that I started to understand the feeling of isolation that Death Stranding presents, and why Iceland is the perfect place to emulate if you want the natural world in your game to convey this wordlessly. We're told through the dialogue that humanity is clinging on by a thread, and are holed up in the last islands of civilization. But it's the world itself that really paints this picture of desperation and isolation. And the world in Death Stranding isn't just a snapshot of different biomes condensed into a playable open world, but is a true reflection of the geological diversity seen in Iceland. We had been walking for 2.5 days at this point, and the differences in terrain would often change dramatically from one valley to the next, or just a few miles apart. And while its inhospitable nature is the perfect backdrop for a game like Death Stranding, its beauty is also anything but bleak. This was day 3 of our 5-day journey, and if all went to plan, we would end the day at the valleys of Thorsmork. After a quick bite to eat, sheltered from the wind behind a rocky outcrop, we continued our way along the cliffs that hugged the Markarfjordur River as it coursed its way southwards. I was inspired to undertake this challenge and travel to Iceland with the hope of further appreciating the world and the themes that Hideo Kojima and his team had presented with Death Stranding. Firstly, how the game mechanics translated into physically traversing such a landscape. And while I wasn't transporting vital provisions to a fractured and scattered nation, I was carrying all of my own provisions and everything I needed to survive the long trek across the remote and beautiful terrain of the Icelandic highlands. And secondly, what would it be like to witness the awesome vistas that played such a heavy role in inspiring Kojima when creating Death Stranding, all while reconnecting with and sharing in the experience with old friends. Before long, we had emerged from between the clustered hills in the Emstrua region and were able to see far to the south and west, where the river stretched to the horizon, along the way claiming its countless streams and tributaries to form a meandering and ever-changing path that would continue for another 30 miles before reaching the Atlantic Ocean. The mountain of Einhjörningur, with its distinctive jagged shape, would be the most consistent and striking feature in the landscape for most of the day. As we encircled its eastern face, clouds occasionally crowned and obscured its peaks. It wasn't until I returned home from the trip that I learned that Einhjörningur actually means unicorn in Icelandic. I personally saw it as more of a rhino, but I'll let you be the judge. After a couple of hours spent navigating up and down the small mossy hills that accompanied the river, we stopped for lunch atop a re-entrant that had unbroken views across the broad river plain that fell away below and to the foothills of the Tindjátlajökull glacier on the other side. After checking our food provisions, we realised we had overestimated how much we would need, which is always a good idea, but figured we could afford to double up on our lunch. I perched myself on a small ledge to eat, while peering off down the valley and surveying the mountains to the south that formed an unbroken line against the horizon, at the base of which we had planned to camp by the day's end. But after a double helping of instant noodles, and with heavy eyes, we decided to rest a while longer in a small grassy depression on the side of the cliff and take a short nap. The days were long this time of year, and we were in no rush. Feeling refreshed from our midday nap, we continued on, and as we parted ways with the river, we turned back to appreciate the distances we had covered that day and take one last look at Einhjörningur as we edged closer to Thorsmork. The mossy ground was gradually turning to blankets of grass, and the landscape for a time would start to resemble something more familiar and less alien. A cold breeze swept over the hill from the south as we tracked our way down the stony path. The river far below looking deceptively still, just a tangle of frozen silver lines drawn across the horizon. But as we got further down, the river became more and more audible. We eventually reached the Throngar River as it spurred on to join its larger brother and continue southward. And, as with the previous day, this river would prove to be too precarious to attempt to film while crossing with my camera in hand, or to set the camera up on one bank, wading back and forth. This was definitely the right choice, however.
I'm gonna go. Come closer then. Right. Now it doesn't matter if you go in. I'm filming it, so no pressure. Oh, that was alright. Look how fast moving that is.
Yeah, I'm going to go down to that bit there and go to the middle and go across.
That might be the better idea, yeah.
After that close call, where I nearly went in for a dip, we found ourselves on the edge of Thorsmork, making our way along its crisscrossing pathways, where the land had sprung to life with ferns, birch, and juniper. We were nearly there, and with only a few more miles to go, we were eager to get our packs off and set up camp for the night. And as we passed up and down the undulating hills, we would occasionally find ourselves above the trees with wide views of the surrounding scenery. Until finally our goal came into view. At the foot of the Fimmvörða House Pass was the Thorsmork Valley and the Crosau River. The backdrop to the valley was an imposing wall of rock in the form of the Katla and Eyjafjallajökull volcanoes, whose heights were entirely obscured by the blanket of cloud that formed the roof above the valley. This was only adding to the daunting feeling I had for tomorrow's climb. But for now, my mind was squarely set on getting to camp and having an ice-cold beer. And despite costing around £12 or $14, it was still one of the most hard-earned and best-tasting beers I've ever had. I'd thankfully not be getting my feet wet first thing as we set off the next day to begin our climb up and over the volcanoes, thanks to a bridge that had been placed over the Crosau River. Due to the fluctuating course of the river as it moves down the valley, it's not possible to set up permanent bridges, so bridges in this area are actually set on wheels, allowing them to be moved and replaced as required. Much like in Death Stranding, I found myself thankful to unknown strangers who had taken the time to make our journey that bit safer, drier, and more convenient. We began our climb along a bushy spur that jutted off from the volcano and once again found ourselves greeted with strikingly beautiful views of mountains made up of an irregular jigsaw of greens and blacks. As we climbed, Thorsmork slowly receded behind us, and the roof of clouds began to press down from above. We took this climb slowly, stopping every few hundred meters to catch our breath. My friend Luke had woken up in the morning feeling a little worse for wear, so this slower pace was to make sure he didn't push himself too hard and risk worsening his condition. We had contemplated leaving the trail early at the start of the day, as Thorsmork would have been the only opportunity we would get to travel back to civilization until the very end of the journey. We had decided to press on, and while the climb was tough, we were certainly being rewarded for our perseverance. With the cloud line now within reach, we first had to climb a scree-covered ridge called Heljakamber, or in English, Hell's Ridge. To the left of us there was a deep gorge that was lined with plunging black cliff faces, and to the right, the land sloped sharply downwards to the west, where the Markarfjota River could be seen again, branching and converging repeatedly as it continued on its course. In the final section of the ridge, I could see how Heljakamba earned its name. A narrow path that was exposed on one side was the only route forward, and as someone who isn't especially fond of heights, I was certainly questioning how safe the flimsy chain with its loose anchoring was. So I put my camera away and gave the crossing my full attention. We stopped at the very edge of the cloud line to rest and take in the views before we would be surrounded by the mist. We had spent 4 days passing over and around the hills and mountains to the north of us, which were all now dwarfed by the slopes of the volcano we were sitting on. For the entire journey, we had been slowly making our way to this point. It represented the final hurdle and one of the biggest challenges we would overcome on the journey. And despite poring over maps, memorizing every route and contour line of the path ahead, I still had a sense of moving into something unknowable and mysterious. Because just as the mountain pass had loomed in the distance for 4 days, so too had the veil of cloud we were about to step into. The landscape changed dramatically as we entered the pass. The vivid greens now nowhere to be seen, replaced entirely with black and white. And despite the fog preventing us from seeing too far in any direction, I knew we were negotiating the routes between two of the youngest mountains in the world, Magni and Mothi, both named for Thor's sons in Norse mythology, which were formed after the eruption of Eyjafjallajökull in 2010. It was eerily quiet, the silence only broken by the crunch of the snow and ice underfoot. We moved slowly across the frozen fields bearing south, until we eventually met a pair of hikers who had gotten a bit turned around while looking for the peaks of Magni and Mothi in the mist. I checked my map and compass, pointing them in the right direction, and then we continued on our separate ways. Despite the rain that had now started to fall around us, we decided to take a short break at the edge of one of the snowfields, where I managed to steal a short nap. We were now roughly at the highest point of the pass, and from here would start our descent towards Skogar, and the end of our journey. Day 4. We had begun the day at the base of the Katla and Eyjafjallajökull volcanoes and climbed our way gradually up their rocky slopes, and were now resting in the scattered snowfields of the Fimmvörðuháls Pass. After a short stop to eat and hydrate among the clouds, we were on our way again, the land folding up and down beneath our feet, contributing to a slow descent of the southern face of the volcanoes. The mix of sand, rock, and ice underfoot made the going tough. The ground was slippery and uneven as we traversed the steep gullies that cut their way across our path as we continued our way towards Skogar. The ragged clouds formed a roof that got gradually higher above our heads as we pressed on, until eventually the terrain sloped away in front of us and we could see, far off in the distance, where the land met the ocean. It appeared tantalizingly within reach, but it would still take a full day's worth of walking before we made it to our endpoint. After hours spent above the snow line in a monochromatic world of ice and rock, the colour was slowly starting to return. Just as the land had given way to the sea, the clouds had begun to break apart and give way to an ocean of sky, and the quintessentially Icelandic mosses were starting to thrive along the banks of the Skogar River. We refilled our water bottles from the river and then allowed it to guide us towards our distant goal, as it intermittently stepped down in small cascades, running along its bed of deep black volcanic rock. The river's path was deeply embedded and its course wouldn't change, and now that we were much closer to civilization, permanent bridges had been built and maintained. We wouldn't be getting our feet wet again for the rest of the journey. We had paced ourselves through the course of the day, stopping regularly to catch our breath. But the effort had taken its toll on Luke, who had woken up that morning feeling nauseous. But despite this, we had made it across one of the biggest challenges the Laugavega Trail had in store for us, and had pushed hard, covering a considerable distance. It wasn't until we were clear of the snows and on the home stretch that the sickness finally caught up with Luke. We decided now would be the best time to make camp and get some rest. But before turning in for the night, and with the sun hanging low in the sky, I decided to spend some time perched above the falls of Stræðafoss and enjoy a good book. We set off the next morning with high spirits. After a night of rest, Luke felt well enough to travel, and we had a much shorter distance to cover today than any previous day. The sun poured into the river valleys that were being fed by the numerous waterfalls that tumbled down the banks, and clouds formed and rolled over the mountains that climbed upwards to the west. Seeing the snowfields that blanketed their peaks, I felt relieved as the sunlight warmed my back and filled me with energy, knowing I wouldn't have to trudge through any more ice or snow. The gentle descent south was accompanied by new waterfalls to admire over every rise and around every bend of the river, some cascading into dark pools that spilled over the precipice and out of sight. The wide open banks of the river got increasingly steeper, until eventually the river surged through a narrow gorge whose bottom was difficult to see through the spray of the waterfalls. And above us the clouds turned grey and heavy with the threat of rain, but with the end of the trail only a few miles away, we weren't too concerned, as we would have a roof and 4 walls to sleep under at the end of the day instead of a tarp. Whether through fatigue, or because I knew my time in Iceland was coming to an end, my pace slowed, and I savoured every step along the increasingly weathered path. The trail had started to show more signs of life, with well-trodden tracks that had been maintained, buildings sporadically coming into view on the distant flats, and the occasional hiker passing us, moving up the mountainside with fresh smiling faces. As we approached the end of the trail, with the river widening, one group of hikers who were travelling the same route but in the opposite direction told us that the weather forecast looked grim for the next 4 days. And, as predicted, there was near enough constant downfall from the moment I got on the bus back to Reykjavik until I boarded my plane nearly 2 days later. We had certainly been lucky with the weather, all things considered. The trail was throwing one last challenge at us before we reached its terminus. Small hillocks waved along the banks of the river, forcing us to make a number of small climbs and descents. My lungs and feet burned as I pushed through, knowing that the end was just a stone's throw away. With each small summit, we expected to reach the edge of the shelf above Skogar, but our goal remained out of sight till the very last moment. As if my body could sense the finish line mere meters away, I started to ache all over, and my knees creaked with every step down the rickety staircase that led to the base of Skogafoss. But despite the protest from my joints, we'd made it. After nearly 60 miles of rivers, mountains, volcanoes and deserts, unrelenting sun and bitter rain, we had made it to Skogar with barely 30 minutes to spare before the only bus for the day could take us back to Reykjavik. We mingled amongst the throng of tourists and took in the power and majesty of Skogafoss. I traced our path up to this point in the map in my head and contemplated one of the hardest journeys I'd ever made. The joy of reaching the finish line intermingled with an almost melancholic feeling that it was all over. But ultimately, the sense of accomplishment outweighed it all. And as I stood there underneath the torrent, that feeling nearly overcame how tired I was, and for a moment, I felt ready to do it all over again. But the allure of a hot shower and a soft bed waiting for me in Reykjavik was eventually all I could think about. Iceland is a land of opposites and juxtapositions. It's where fire meets ice, it's inhospitable yet undeniably beautiful. It appears almost prehistoric and ancient, yet, geologically speaking, it's one of the youngest land masses on the planet, having formed a mere 25 million years ago. It's still forming today, as demonstrated by the creation of Magni and Modi in the eruptions of March 2010. And Death Stranding's in-universe explanation for North America seemingly being Iceland is that the land is also young, its time having been stolen away by the rain, shaped through the violence of void-outs, torn apart and rebirthed into something new but primordial. These dichotomies are present all throughout Death Stranding as well. Life and death being inextricably intertwined, hope in the face of the hopelessness of extinction, the importance of the soul and the body, the ha and the ka, being a prominent concept in its lore. The old rely on the young to navigate the perils of this new and dangerous world, acting as their bridge to the future. The necessity to form connections and bonds while playing as a protagonist who is literally unable to make physical contact with the living or with the dead because it causes a matter-antimatter reaction that can level cities. Iceland serves as the perfect backdrop for a game like Death Stranding, and after experiencing it in as close to the way Sam does as I could, by spending 5 days hauling myself and my heavy backpack across its formidable and awesome terrain, I was certainly able to see how Kojima's vacation to the country in 2014 was able to inspire and influence Death Stranding's world, its lore and music, but also its gameplay mechanics too. Death Stranding's moment-to-moment gameplay at its core is about navigation and traversal, or to put it in a way that has been used with negative connotations, it's a walking simulator, and I don't necessarily want to shy away from describing it as such. You don't simply get from A to B by pressing W or holding down the analog stick. The vast majority of your time in-game will be spent navigating the challenges of your journey from A to B. It's not simply a map with outposts to travel between, completing your objectives at each point before moving on to the next, with the occasional enemy or distraction in between, or providing a screenshot-worthy vista. It's not just a pretty world, and this concept that is so ubiquitous across almost all open-world games is flipped entirely on its head with Death Stranding. It's the spaces between point A and point B that are the challenge, and the primary reason for the open-world nature of Death Stranding. The vistas are hard-earned. From the smallest boulder to the tallest cliff, vast rivers or deep canyons, the world itself is what needs to be beaten and overcome by planning your routes and ensuring you have the right gear to conquer these obstacles and terrain features. Ensuring that the gear is kept in working order and is packed and arranged optimally to maintain balance. And in that respect, Death Stranding excels at being a walking simulator by offering well thought out and fun mechanisms that approximate real life hiking and land navigation. And when the world is more than just a set piece, but is intrinsic to the story, its themes, and gameplay mechanics alike, Iceland has the character and diversity of terrain that fits this end perfectly.